Welcome to our journey into the depths of the mind, a place where most battles are not fought with weapons, but with thoughts. In today's lecture, Kill Your Negative Thoughts, Carl Jung, we will explore how Jung's profound understanding of the unconscious mind reveals the real roots of negative thinking, and how to confront and transform them from within. Jung never said to kill a thought violently, but he did insist that you must become conscious of what lies beneath your thinking patterns, your fears, your doubts, your inner critic. They are not just thoughts. They are symbols, shadows, unmet wounds, echoes from the unconscious. And unless you face them, they will shape your life from the darkness. Negative thoughts are not merely random or surface-level intrusions. According to Carl Jung, they are often deeply rooted in the unconscious and originate from psychic material that has been repressed or denied. To truly understand and address negative thinking, one must venture beyond cognitive self-help strategies and examine the inner terrain of the psyche where these thoughts are born. Jung believed that the unconscious mind holds not only forgotten memories but also rejected emotions, instincts, and potentials that the conscious ego finds uncomfortable or unacceptable. When these contents are repressed, they do not vanish. Instead, they gather force in the dark and manifest in disguised forms among them, persistent negative thoughts that seem to arise uninvited and uncontrollable. These thoughts, such as "I'm not good enough," "everyone is against me," or "I will never succeed," are rarely based on pure reason. More often, they are symptoms of deeper psychological conflicts. They are messages from the unconscious that the conscious mind does not yet understand. You maintain that the unconscious communicates symbolically, and when we fail to listen to its symbols, it resorts to more disruptive methods such as anxiety, depression, obsessions, or compulsive thought patterns. Negative thinking, in this sense, is not a flaw to be eliminated, but a signal that points to unresolved inner tensions. These thoughts are not enemies to be suppressed, but symptoms to be decoded. The unconscious mind contains personal material memories, traumas, forgotten feelings, and collective material, which Jung called the collective unconscious. This deeper layer includes archetypes and patterns that all human beings share. When certain archetypes are activated in a negative or disharmonious way, they may distort perception and influence thought patterns. For example, the archetype of the victim may cause an individual to interpret neutral events as hostile, fostering a stream of thoughts filled with paranoia or hopelessness. The archetype of the inner critic part of the negative paternal or superego image can give rise to self-attacking thoughts that feel like objective truth. These thoughts have weight not because they're rational, but because they are energized by unconscious material that has never been brought into the light of awareness. Jung emphasized that what we repress does not simply disappear, it becomes autonomous. A repressed thought or emotion becomes split off from the ego and forms a complex, an emotionally charged cluster of ideas with its own will and voice. Complexes can hijack consciousness, inserting negative or irrational thoughts into the psyche seemingly at random. A person may be flooded with shame after a small mistake or spiral into despair after a minor criticism, not because of the event itself, but because it triggered a complex already present in the unconscious. These complexes operate like splinters in the mind, carrying unresolved feelings from childhood, ancestral trauma, or deeply internalized social conditioning. Their influence can be traced in recurring thought loops, compulsive fears, or internal dialogues that undermine self-worth. Jung taught that to liberate ourselves from these patterns, we must bring the contents of the unconscious into consciousness. This process involves radical honesty and the courage to confront what we have long avoided. It requires facing not only personal wounds, but also the parts of ourselves we judge, dislike, or fear. This confrontation, which he called the encounter with the shadow, is often painful but necessary. The shadow includes everything we have disowned: anger, envy, weakness, desire, ambition, and when these elements are not integrated, they seep into the conscious mind in distorted ways. Negative thoughts are often a reflection of this disowned shadow material. For example, a person who refuses to acknowledge their own anger may instead be plagued by thoughts that the world is hostile, cruel, or unfair. The more distant we are from our unconscious material, the more control it exerts over us. As Jung famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Negative thoughts that feel fated or inevitable are often the unconscious mind's way of signaling that something inside us needs to be recognized and worked through. Simply trying to think positively without addressing the underlying cause is like painting over rust. The root of the corrosion remains, and over time, it will resurface in some other form. Real transformation begins when we stop resisting our inner experience and start listening to what it is trying to teach us. Dreams are one of the ways the unconscious communicates its contents. Jung encouraged his patients to write down and analyze their dreams, not because dreams predict the future, but because they reveal the psychic situation of the individual. A dream filled with dark or disturbing images may be expressing the presence of repressed emotions or unresolved inner conflict. By working with such images, the individual begins to integrate what has been split off. This integration has the effect of reducing the intensity of negative thoughts because the psychic energy that once fueled them has now been consciously acknowledged and redirected. In Jung's model, healing comes not from eliminating the darkness, but from giving it a seat at the table of the self. The ego resists this process because it clings to its identity and fears the unknown. It prefers certainty, even if that certainty is painful. The ego often tries to suppress or ignore negative thoughts rather than explore them, hoping that distraction or discipline will suffice. But what is repressed becomes more powerful. Jung likened the unconscious to nature. It is vast, complex, and cannot be bullied into submission. The path forward is not domination, but dialogue. When we turn toward our negative thoughts with curiosity instead of fear, we open the door to inner transformation. We begin to see that the thought "I am worthless" may conceal a wound from early childhood, a voice we absorbed from a parent or authority figure, or a response to years of rejection that was never grieved. These thoughts are not facts, they are emotional truths, and they require healing, not punishment. This is why the process of individuation, the becoming of one's true self, requires us to face our inner darkness. To become whole, we must reclaim what we have lost, hidden, or rejected. This is not a one-time event, but an ongoing journey, one that demands reflection, humility, and depth. The more we understand where our negative thoughts come from, the less we are at their mercy. We no longer identify with them blindly or fight them in futility. Instead, we meet them with awareness, compassion, and the resolve to transform them into insight. By bringing these thoughts into the light of consciousness, we dissolve their toxic power and reclaim the psychic energy they had been draining. We become more centered, more grounded, more resilient, and more fully alive. The shadow, in Carl Jung's psychological framework, represents the unconscious part of the personality that the ego does not identify with. It includes traits, emotions, impulses, and desires that we deny, suppress, or reject because they are incompatible with our self-image or the social roles we play. Jung believed that confronting the shadow is essential for psychological health and spiritual growth. When we refuse to acknowledge the darker aspects of our psyche, they do not disappear. They manifest in distorted and destructive forms, often as negative thoughts, irrational reactions, and self-sabotaging behaviors. To kill negative thoughts at the root, we must understand that many of them are the disguised voices of the shadow, seeking recognition, expression, and integration. The process of shadow formation begins early in life. As children, we learn which behaviors are acceptable and which are not, both from our families and from the broader culture. We quickly discover that certain traits, such as anger, envy, pride, or even creativity and assertiveness, may provoke disapproval or punishment. To survive and gain love or approval, we begin to suppress these unacceptable traits and hide them from others and eventually from ourselves. They sink into the unconscious, forming the shadow. But these repressed elements do not vanish. Instead, they remain energetically active beneath the surface of the psyche, influencing our emotions, thoughts, and relationships in ways we do not fully understand. One of the primary ways the shadow expresses itself is through internalized negativity. This can take the form of self-judgment, chronic guilt, obsessive worrying, fear of failure, or inner narratives that repeat themes of worthlessness or powerlessness. These are not random thoughts, they are signals. They arise from the disowned parts of ourselves that long to be seen and accepted. When we think, "I'm not good enough," the thought may not be a fact, but a reflection of a deeper emotional wound related to a part of ourselves we have rejected. Jung emphasized that these thoughts must be explored, not suppressed. They are symbolic expressions of the hidden self. Ignoring or avoiding the shadow only strengthens its hold. The more we try to distance ourselves from our dark side, the more control it exerts over us. This is why some people are haunted by compulsive negative thoughts or engage in destructive behaviors they cannot explain. The shadow, when denied, gains autonomy. It acts out in subtle and not so subtle ways through sarcasm, addictions, depression, anxiety, passive aggression, or overwhelming inner criticism. These are always the unconscious attempts to make itself known. Jung wrote that the shadow is 90% pure gold, not because it is good in the moral sense, but because it contains essential aspects of our being that we have lost contact with. Within the shadow, not only our fears and weaknesses, but also our buried strengths, our passion, our creativity, and our authenticity. To truly confront and transform negative thoughts, one must develop a relationship with the shadow. This begins with radical honesty, the willingness to see oneself clearly and without self-deception. It involves observing thoughts without immediately believing or reacting to them. It means asking, what part of me is speaking through this thought, and what have I not allowed myself to feel or express? This inquiry requires courage, because the ego is deeply invested in maintaining a positive self-image. Confronting the shadow often shatters the illusion of being wholly good, rational, or in control. But this shattering is necessary for growth. Jung believed that wholeness, not perfection, is the goal of individuation, and wholeness includes the darkness. Working with the shadow also involves recognizing projection, the psychological defense mechanism by which we attribute our disowned traits to others. For example, we may accuse others of being selfish, arrogant, or manipulative, while remaining blind to these traits in ourselves. Projection keeps the shadow hidden and maintains the illusion that our negativity originates from the outside world. But once we take back these projections, we begin to see that the judgments we pass on others often reveal what we most fear or dislike in ourselves. This realization can be humbling, but it is also liberating. By owning our projections, we reclaim the parts of ourselves we have disowned, and the compulsive need to criticize or blame others begins to fade. The energy that once fueled negative thoughts is redirected towards self-awareness and inner balance. Shadow work also benefits greatly from the practice of active imagination, a technique developed by Jung to dialogue with unconscious contents. In active imagination, a person allows an image, thought, or feeling to emerge spontaneously from the unconscious, and then engages with it creatively, as if it were a living presence. For example, one might visualize the inner critic as a figure, and ask it questions, listen to its answers, or even argue with it. This process transforms the negative thought from a formless tormentor into a noble aspect of the psyche. It creates distance between the self and the thought and reveals the unmet need or emotional truth behind it. Through such engagement, the shadow begins to lose its power to dominate and becomes instead a source of insight and inner guidance. Dreams are another important avenue for shadow integration. Often, the shadow appears in dreams as a threatening figure, a monster, an enemy, or even a friend we misunderstand. Jung believed that these dream figures are not to be feared or rejected, but understood. They symbolize the aspects of ourselves that we have excluded and now must reintegrate. A recurring dream of failure, humiliation, or conflict may point directly to the part of the psyche that feels unloved, unseen, or unexpressed. By reflecting on these dreams and seeking their meaning, we begin to uncover the deeper layers of our inner world, and as we do, the grip of negative thoughts loosens. In Jung's view, moral judgment is often the biggest obstacle to shadow work. People are conditioned to think of themselves as good and may feel deep shame about their darker impulses. But Jung warned that the desire to appear morally pure often leads to hypocrisy and repression. Instead of judging the shadow, he advised us to approach it with curiosity and even respect. What seems dark may contain hidden light. The angry outburst may conceal a long-denied need for boundaries. The jealous thought may signal a hunger for recognition. The self-critical voice may be the echo of a neglected inner child. By examining these thoughts with compassion and symbolic awareness, we uncover their deeper message and begin the slow process of transformation. This inner work is not a one-time fix, but a lifelong practice. The shadow evolves as we evolve, and new layers emerge at different stages of life. But each confrontation with the shadow brings more consciousness, more freedom, and more authenticity. As we integrate these hidden parts, the negative thoughts that once plagued us begin to lose their sting. They no longer control us from the dark. They become signals rather than saboteurs, messengers from the unconscious, inviting us to heal, to grow, and to become whole. Becoming conscious of inner conflict is the first step to transformation, a truth Carl Jung emphasized throughout his work on individuation and the unconscious. The human psyche is not a unified structure, but a dynamic and often contradictory system of forces, desires, beliefs, fears, memories, and instincts, all interacting beneath the surface of our conscious awareness. Much of what we experience as negative thinking originates not from objective reality, but from these internal conflicts, tensions between our conscious goals and our unconscious fears, between who we are and who we think we should be, between the ego and the deeper self. Jung taught that these conflicts are not problems to be eradicated, but signals to be understood. They are doorways into the psyche that, once entered consciously, can lead to profound healing and personal evolution. For many, inner conflict manifests as persistent doubt, self-criticism, anxiety, or emotional paralysis. These feelings often arise in moments when the ego's carefully crafted identity is challenged by a deeper truth emerging from the unconscious. For example, a person may strive to be successful and driven, while unconsciously feeling worthless or afraid of failure. The result is a cycle of overcompensation, burnout, and inner despair. Rather than confronting this dissonance directly, the mind often reacts by generating negative thoughts, which serve as a kind of defense mechanism, keeping the conflict suppressed, but also unresolved. These thoughts become the surface-level symptoms of a much deeper psychological process. Until the conflict is made conscious, the mind will continue to loop through negativity as the way of avoiding the deeper work. Jung believed that the psyche strives toward balance. Inner conflict is the psyche's way of calling attention to the fact that some part of the self has been neglected, repressed, or distorted. By becoming aware of this tension, the individual has the opportunity to engage in the process of individuation, the integration of all aspects of the self, both light and dark, into a unified whole. This is not an intellectual process, but an emotional and symbolic one. It involves facing the discomfort, listening to what the conflict is trying to communicate, and allowing the psyche to reorganize itself around a more honest and inclusive understanding of who we are. One of the reasons people resist becoming conscious of inner conflict is that it threatens their self-image. The ego wants to see itself as consistent, coherent, and in control. But the unconscious cares nothing for the ego's pride. It operates through symbols, dreams, projections, and irrational impulses, all of which are designed to reveal the truth that the ego cannot face on its own. When a person begins to pay attention to their dreams, emotional triggers, or irrational fears, they often discover that what they thought was a flaw or weakness is actually a vital message from the unconscious. These messages rarely make sense at first. They may appear as confusion, disorientation, or emotional chaos. But Jung emphasized that this chaos is the raw material of transformation. Only by entering into it rather than running from it can we begin to find the deeper order waiting to emerge. This work requires a willingness to sit with discomfort. When a negative thought arises, the reflex is to push it away, silence it, or replace it with a positive affirmation. While this may offer temporary relief, it does not resolve the underlying conflict. Instead, Jung encouraged people to observe the thought with curiosity. Where does it come from? What emotion does it carry? What memory or image does it evoke? Often, the thought is linked to a moment in the past where the individual felt powerless, unseen, or unworthy. The current negativity is not just about the present, it is a reactivation of that original wound. By tracing the thread of the thought back to its source, we begin to understand its purpose. It is not an enemy, but a messenger. Another aspect of becoming conscious of inner conflict is recognizing the role of opposites in the psyche. Jung believed that every psychological quality contains its opposite. Where there is love, there is the possibility of hate. Where there is strength, there is the potential for weakness. The ego tends to identify with one side and deny the other. This creates imbalance and internal tension. For example, someone who prides themselves on being compassionate may repress their anger, leading to passive aggression or burnout. Someone who identifies with strength may deny vulnerability, leading to emotional disconnection. The resolution of inner conflict lies in the reconciliation of these opposites, not by choosing one over the other, but by holding the tension between them until a new synthesis emerges. Jung called this the transcendent function, a psychological process that gives rise to new consciousness when opposing forces are held in awareness without being forced into premature resolution. This is not an easy process. It can feel like being pulled into directions, like living in ambiguity or contradiction. But this tension is fertile ground for growth. When we allow the conflict to exist without trying to escape it, something new is born within us. A deeper truth reveals itself. We begin to see that we are not just our thoughts or feelings, but the conscious space in which they occur. This shift in perspective is transformative. Negative thoughts lose their grip when we understand them as parts of a larger dialogue within the self, rather than as absolute truths about who we are. Therapeutic practices like journaling, meditation, depth analysis, and dream interpretation can support this work by providing structure and guidance. They help externalize the inner conflict so it can be examined and engaged with creatively. In therapy, a person might speak with different parts of themselves as if they were characters giving voice to the inner critic, the wounded child, the wise self. This dialogical approach allows the conflicting aspects of the psyche to be seen, heard, and eventually reconciled. Over time, this leads to a more integrated sense of self, one that can hold complexity without being overwhelmed by it. Jung warned that those who avoid inner conflict often project it onto the world. They see enemies everywhere, blame others for their suffering, or become obsessed with controlling their environment. This projection keeps the real conflict hidden and perpetuates the cycle of negativity. But when we turn inward and become conscious of our own contradictions, we reclaim our power. We stop reacting automatically and begin responding with awareness. The energy that once fueled our inner battles is released for creative and purposeful living. To become conscious of inner conflict is to step into the role of the observer, the one who can witness without judgment, who can feel deeply without being consumed. It is to recognize that behind every negative thought is a deeper invitation to wholeness. Each conflict is a crossroad, a chance to evolve, to meet ourselves with more compassion and truth. Jung's work reminds us that the path to healing does not lie in denial, but in courageous self-confrontation. Through this process, the psyche begins to harmonize from within, and the noise of negativity gives way to the quiet clarity of integration. Projection of inner negativity distorts our perception of others, a central insight in Carl Jung's psychology. The unconscious mind, filled with repressed desires, fears, and unresolved conflicts, does not remain silent. It demands to be expressed, and when it cannot speak directly through conscious awareness, it projects itself onto the external world, especially onto other people. What we cannot or will not face within ourselves, we see exaggerated or distorted in those around us. A person filled with self-doubt may see others as critical, threatening, or arrogant. Someone repressing their own anger may experience the world as hostile or unfair. This mechanism of projection is often invisible to the one projecting. It feels like objective truth rather than a reflection of inner turmoil. Jung explained that projection is not merely a psychological trick of the mind but a way the unconscious seeks integration. The psyche attempts to externalize what it cannot process internally, hoping that through interaction with the external world, those unconscious contents will eventually be seen and reclaimed. However, when projections go unnoticed, they become toxic. They distort relationships, fuel judgment, and perpetuate cycles of misunderstanding and conflict. An individual begins to confuse the inner world with the outer, reacting not to who people actually are, but to the symbolic roles they unknowingly fulfill in that person's inner drama. A harsh parent figure be unconsciously projected onto an authority figure, leading to irrational fear or defiance. A repressed desire for freedom may be projected onto a reckless friend, who then becomes the scapegoat for the individual's own suppressed longings. This process becomes especially destructive when the negative projections are constant and unconscious. Jung noted that the shadow, the dark, rejected part of the personality contains traits the ego refuses to accept. These traits are then projected onto others, making the individual believe those qualities exist outside themselves. The judgmental person accuses others of being judgmental. The dishonest person is obsessed with exposing the lies of others. The insecure person accuses others of arrogance or pride. In each case, the real battle is within, but it is played out in social interactions, relationships, and even in cultural and political narratives. This is why projection can be dangerous. Not only does it cloud perception, but it also prevents personal responsibility and inner transformation. Recognizing projection requires deep honesty and introspection. It asks us to question our emotional reactions, to look closely at the people who trigger us the most, and to consider whether they are truly the cause of our distress or whether they are simply reflecting something unacknowledged in ourselves. Jung emphasized that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves. The more intensely we react, the more likely it is that something personal is being touched. This is not to say others are never wrong or harmful, but rather that our strongest reactions often point to our own unresolved material. One way projection reveals itself is through overreaction. A small comment or action from another person provokes a disproportionately large emotional response. The reaction feels justified, but upon closer reflection, it is often tied to something deeper, perhaps a childhood wound, a fear of rejection, or a hidden sense of inadequacy. The individual is not merely reacting to the present moment, but to an entire complex of feelings stored in the unconscious. Projection allows this emotional charge to be displaced onto someone else, keeping the real source of pain hidden. Another sign of projection is when we idealize or demonize others. Both extremes are distortions. When we place someone on a pedestal, seeing them as flawless or godlike, we may be projecting a part of our own undeveloped potential onto them. We see in them what we wish we could become, rather than recognizing those same possibilities within ourselves. Conversely, when we vilify others, seeing them as pure evil, irredeemable, or threatening, we are often externalizing parts of ourselves we fear or despise. This is especially common in group dynamics, where projection contributes to prejudice, scapegoating, and conflict between communities or nations. The other becomes a mirror for all that is feared or rejected within the group's collective unconscious. Jung believed that withdrawing projections is one of the most important steps in psychological development. It is not easy, because it requires the individual to reclaim what they have denied and to accept responsibility for their own inner life. This process begins by observing patterns. What kinds of people consistently evoke strong emotions? What qualities do we admire or detest in others? What narratives do we repeat about the world around us? By reflecting on these questions, we start to see where the line between self and other has become blurred. We recognize that what we thought was out there is also in here. Withdrawing projections does not mean excusing harmful behavior or suppressing real concerns. Rather, it means separating what belongs to the self from what genuinely belongs to others. It is about seeing clearly. When we stop projecting our own darkness onto others, we begin to see them as they are: complex, flawed, and human. This opens the door to empathy, compassion, and authentic connection. We are no longer reacting to our own inner shadows disguised as external threats, but engaging with reality as it is. In this way, the energy once wasted on judgment and blame is redirected inward, where it can be used for healing and growth. The practice of shadow work, as Jung described it, is deeply connected to the work of reclaiming projections. It involves confronting those parts of ourselves we would rather not see: the selfishness, the envy, the rage, the vulnerability. By naming and accepting these parts, we reduce their unconscious hold over us. We become less reactive, more centered, and more capable of choosing our responses. The world becomes less threatening, not because it has changed, but because we have changed our relationship to it. This work is not meant to be done in isolation. Relationships provide the perfect mirror for projection. A therapist, mentor, or close friend can help illuminate our blind spots, especially when we are willing to receive feedback with humility. Jung emphasized that the path to wholeness is not solitary, it is relational. Through our interactions with others, we come to see ourselves more clearly. Every conflict, every admiration, every judgment is an opportunity to look within and ask, what is this revealing about me? As we continue this inner work, projection becomes less of a burden and more of a guide. It points to what needs attention, what still lies in shadow, what is waiting to be reclaimed. It teaches us that the external world, with all its drama and beauty, is not separate from us, but intimately connected to our inner landscape. When we learn to see through projection, we begin to live with greater integrity. We stop blaming and start understanding. We stop reacting and start relating. The mind quiets, not because we have silenced it, but because we have listened. And in that listening, we find not only ourselves, but the world as it truly is. Suppressing negative thoughts strengthens their unconscious power, a psychological paradox that Carl Jung explored with striking clarity. The human mind, in its instinctive desire for peace and order, often tries to push away uncomfortable feelings, dark memories, and intrusive thoughts. However, this act of suppression doesn't eliminate those elements from the psyche. Instead, it buries them deeper into the unconscious, where they gain intensity, emotional charge, and symbolic force. What we resist does not dissolve, it grows, transforms, and waits for an opportunity to re-emerge in more disruptive and often less controllable forms. The more forcefully we deny our negative thoughts, the more potent their unconscious energy becomes. Jung observed that the unconscious is not a passive container of forgotten content. It is alive, dynamic, and always in motion. It contains not only memories and instincts, but also emotional energy. When we suppress a negative thought such as fear, jealousy, rage, or despair, we are not just forgetting it, we are also rejecting the emotional energy it carries. That energy does not vanish. It remains active in the psyche, influencing our behavior from behind the curtain of awareness. This can lead to anxiety, compulsions, irrational fears, mood swings, and even physical symptoms that appear inexplicable. The psyche will express what the ego tries to ignore. This is one of the reasons Jung warned against the moralistic stance of trying to appear or feel good by forcibly rejecting everything bad or unpleasant in the name of virtue or emotional control. Many people suppress parts of themselves they consider unworthy or shameful, but those parts do not simply go away. They retreat into the unconscious, join the shadow, and then operate from the dark corners of the mind outside of conscious control. Suppressed negativity becomes shadow material. And, as Jung explained, the shadow that is not integrated will inevitably be projected or acted out in harmful, compulsive ways. For example, a person who refuses to acknowledge their own anger may become overly passive or compliant, but that anger doesn't disappear. It simmers beneath the surface and might erupt in sudden outbursts, passive-aggressive behavior, or resentment that poisons relationships. Another individual may suppress feelings of inadequacy or self-doubt, only to find themselves overly critical of others, constantly comparing, or sabotaging their own success. These behaviors seem disconnected from the suppressed thought, but, in reality, they are symptoms of the same repressed energy trying to find expression. The problem is not the negative thought itself, it is the refusal to face it. Jung emphasized that the path to psychological wholeness requires us to face the totality of our inner experience, including what we find painful, dark, or unwanted. Every suppressed thought has a message. It speaks to a need, a wound, a fear, or a memory that has not yet been integrated into the conscious self. When we suppress these thoughts, we cut ourselves off from parts of our own story. We lose access to the wisdom and healing that comes from honest self-awareness. Suppression is often unconscious. People are taught from a young age to hide certain emotions or thoughts. Don't cry. Don't be angry. Don't be weak. Over time, this conditioning leads individuals to censor their own minds before they are even aware of it. The mind develops filters, defense mechanisms, and rationalizations to keep negative content from surfacing. But this creates a division. Within the psyche, the persona, the mask we show the world, and the shadow, the part we hide, even from ourselves. The more we suppress, the wider the gap grows between these two selves, and the greater that gap, the more inner tension, anxiety, and disconnection we experience. This inner division drains psychological energy. Suppressing thoughts takes effort. It requires constant mental policing and emotional avoidance. Over time, this leads to fatigue, burnout, or emotional numbness. People may feel like they are surviving rather than living, managing rather than thriving. Suppression disconnects us from our emotional intelligence and intuitive insight. When we numb one part of our emotional spectrum, we often numb others as well. The result is a dull, reactive, and defensive mode of living rather than one that is present, curious, and self-aware. Jung offered an alternative to suppression, conscious confrontation and integration. Instead of rejecting negative thoughts, we can observe them, reflect on them, and try to understand what they are communicating. This doesn't mean indulging every dark impulse or identifying with every fearful thought. It means creating space in the psyche where those thoughts can be seen without judgment. In this space of awareness, the thought loses its compulsive grip. It becomes something to work with, rather than something to fight against. The energy that was once trapped in suppression can be reclaimed and redirected into personal growth, creativity, and authentic self-expression. Practices such as active imagination, dream work, journaling, and mindful self-inquiry can help bring suppressed thoughts into conscious awareness. These methods create a dialogue with the unconscious rather than a war against it. They allow the psyche to express itself symbolically and emotionally, which is often the only way suppressed content can safely surface. The goal is not to eliminate all negativity, but to transform it, to alchemize it into something meaningful. Jung believed that within the darkness lies the seed of transformation. By facing what we fear, we open the door to psychological rebirth. Suppression also creates a false self-image. When we deny our negative thoughts, we present a version of ourselves that is incomplete. This can lead to feelings of inauthenticity or imposter syndrome. We may fear being found out or exposed. Deep down, we sense that something important is missing from our self-understanding. This inner dissonance affects our relationships, making it difficult to connect honestly or vulnerably. People sense when we are not being fully ourselves, even if they can't articulate why. Authenticity begins when we stop pretending to be perfect and start acknowledging our full emotional landscape. In many ways, suppressed negativity acts like emotional debt. It doesn't disappear, it accumulates, and eventually, it demands repayment. This can come in the form of psychological breakdowns, identity crises, or life circumstances that force us to confront what we've been avoiding. Jung referred to this as the return of the repressed. What we do not face voluntarily will return involuntarily. But the good news is that the earlier we begin the work of conscious integration, the more empowered we become. We no longer live in fear of our own minds. We begin to trust ourselves to face reality as it is and to respond with clarity and strength. Ultimately, suppression is rooted in fear. Fear of pain, fear of being overwhelmed, fear of what we might discover about ourselves. But Jung's work reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the willingness to face it. And by facing our negative thoughts, we reclaim our inner power. We stop running, we stop pretending, we begin to live from a place of psychological truth, where all parts of the self are welcomed, seen, and transformed. Awareness and self-observation neutralize the toxic power of the mind, not by force, but by the simple act of becoming conscious. Carl Jung emphasized the critical role of consciousness in psychological healing, highlighting that what remains unconscious will continue to control our lives until we bring it into awareness. Negative thoughts are not inherently dangerous. It is our unconscious identification with them that gives them power. When we become fully aware of our mental processes, we create a psychological distance between the self and the thought. This separation allows us to observe rather than absorb, to notice rather than react, and in doing so, we reclaim agency over our own minds. The mind, especially when left unchecked, operates in loops. Thought patterns built over years often run on autopilot. These loops are strengthened by emotion, memory, and repetition. The more we unconsciously react to these loops, the more ingrained they become. Self-observation is the method by which we interrupt this cycle. It is the ability to stand apart from the thought and see it as a passing mental event, not an absolute truth. This perspective shift is the beginning of liberation. Jung spoke of this as the observing ego, the capacity of the conscious mind to reflect upon itself and its own contents. This reflection is what allows us to disempower the inner critic, the compulsive fear, or the depressive spiral that might otherwise dominate our internal experience. When we practice awareness, we activate the part of the psyche that can witness, without judgment. This witnessing presence does not fight the negative thought. It simply sees it, and what is seen begins to change. The reason negative thoughts hold us captive is because we fuse with them, we believe them, we identify with them, we let them define who we are. Awareness dissolves this fusion. It says, I am having this thought, but I am not this thought. That subtle but powerful shift, what Jungian psychology calls a movement toward individuation, the becoming of the self through conscious differentiation from the unconscious. Self-observation is not self-judgment. It is not another tool to criticize ourselves for having negativity. Rather, it is a quiet, curious, compassionate look inward. We begin to ask, where did this thought come from? What emotion is fueling it? What memory does it echo? What unmet need lies beneath it? These questions invite insight, and insight transforms experience. Jung taught that insight brings light into darkness. The unconscious is not evil, It is simply unknown. By becoming aware of what lies within us, we begin to dispel the fear that comes from not knowing. When we observe our thoughts, over time, patterns emerge. We begin to notice recurring themes, perhaps a fear of rejection, a sense of inadequacy, a tendency to catastrophize. Each of these themes has a psychological root. They may stem from early childhood experiences, parental messages, traumatic moments, or societal conditioning. Awareness turns these vague feelings into specific narratives, and once we recognize the narrative, we can begin to question it. This act of questioning breaks the spell of unconscious belief. We are no longer passive recipients of our thoughts, we become active participants in shaping our mental reality. There is also an alchemical quality to awareness. In Jung's view, consciousness is the great healer. It is like fire that transforms raw material into refined substance. When a negative thought is brought into conscious awareness, its energy can be redirected. Instead of being stuck in rumination or emotional paralysis, that same energy can be used for creative expression, decision-making, or inner growth. Jung believed that psychic energy is never destroyed, it only changes form. Awareness is the catalyst for that transformation. A major aspect of this awareness involves tracking emotional responses. Negative thoughts often carry a strong emotional charge, which is what makes them feel so real and urgent. By observing our emotional reactions without immediately acting on them, we begin to disentangle emotion from interpretation. We realize that feeling afraid does not always mean we are in danger. Feeling worthless does not mean we have no value. Emotions are signals, not conclusions. Self-observation allows us to pause between feeling and response, creating the space needed for a more thoughtful, balanced, and conscious choice. In daily life, awareness can be practiced moment by moment. It may begin as noticing when the mind shifts into judgment, worrying, or self-criticism. It may involve recognizing when we are triggered, when we are avoiding, when we are caught in comparison. These small moments of noticing, not small at all, they are the foundation of psychological freedom. Every time we catch ourselves in a loop and bring our attention to it, we weaken its unconscious grip. We rewire the brain toward clarity, not confusion. We affirm our role as the observer, not the victim of the mind. One of the tools Jung encouraged for developing self-awareness was dream analysis. Dreams are messages from the unconscious, filled with symbols, archetypes, and repressed content. By observing our dreams and reflecting on their meaning, we gain access to parts of the psyche that are not easily visible during waking life. Keeping a dream journal and contemplating recurring symbols is one way to deepen the practice of inner observation. Over time, this leads to increased emotional intelligence, sharper intuition, and a more integrated sense of self. Another path to awareness through shadow work, the deliberate exploration of those parts of ourselves we usually hide or deny. This includes not only socially unacceptable traits, but also hidden strengths, desires, and potentials. Self-observation, when applied to the shadow, involves watching for projections, the tendency to attribute to others what we refuse to see in ourselves. For example, the person we judge harshly may mirror a trait we have disowned. Recognizing this projection is a powerful form of awakening. It transforms outer conflict into inner insight. Meditative practices can also support the cultivation of awareness. Meditation is not about stopping thoughts, but observing them without attachment. Over time, this trains the mind to remain centered even in the presence of negativity. The more we practice awareness and stillness, the more naturally it arises during stress or emotional turbulence. Meditation creates an inner sanctuary, a space where thoughts pass through, but do not define us. In Jungian terms, it strengthens the ego-self axis, the relationship between the conscious self and the deeper, wiser center of the psyche. Awareness is not a quick fix. It requires patience, courage, and ongoing commitment, but it is the only way to truly neutralize the toxic power of the mind. Suppression and denial only delay the reckoning. Distraction offers momentary relief, but no real healing. Awareness, on the other hand, invites us to stay present with our inner world, to meet it with curiosity, compassion, and honesty. This meeting is not always comfortable, but it is always transformative. The mind loses its toxic grip not because it has been conquered, but because it has been seen. And what is seen clearly can no longer manipulate us from the shadows. The mind is a battleground, and in this battlefield, the most potent weapon is not force, but awareness. Jung taught that what we are unconscious of will rule us, and the moment we become conscious of it, we reclaim our power. Awareness and self-observation are the silent revolution within, the tools that dissolve the tyranny of toxic thinking not by attack, but by presence. When we observe our thoughts instead of identifying with them, we introduce a gap between stimulus and response. In that sacred space, we find freedom. This freedom is the essence of psychological health. It does not mean we no longer have negative thoughts. It means they no longer have us. Self-observation is the process by which we begin to see the inner workings of the psyche in real time. It is not an intellectual exercise, but a lived awareness, noticing when the thought arises, how it affects our emotions, how it influences our body, and what reaction it triggers. This moment-to-moment tracking of our internal environment reveals patterns. We begin to see that many of our negative thoughts are not personal but patterned, repetitive, conditioned. They are echoes of earlier experiences, parental voices, societal imprints. By seeing them clearly, we deconstruct the illusion that they are true or ours. Jung insisted that the path to individuation, the full realization of the self, passes through the willingness to observe the contents of our own minds with honesty and neutrality. Neutral observation is the key. The moment we start judging what we observe, we slip back into the unconscious. Self-observation is not self-condemnation. It is the clarity that arises when the ego steps aside and the witnessing presence takes the seat of consciousness. This inner witness watches without blaming. It does not rush to fix or suppress. It simply sees. And in the act of seeing, the identification with the thought weakens. We stop reacting from the thought and begin relating to it. This subtle shift is profound. It means we are no longer merged with fear, shame, or anger. We are aware of it, and therefore we have choice. Jung often described the psyche as a living organism with its own structure and order. Thoughts, especially negative ones, are part of that structure, often acting as signals of unresolved tension, shadow content, or split-off parts of the self. Awareness brings these parts into view. It shines light on what has been hidden, and as we continue the practice of self-observation, these fragments begin to integrate. The mind, instead of being a battlefield of opposing forces, begins to resemble a dialogue, an inner conversation guided by presence rather than chaos. This internal presence is strengthened through practice. In the beginning, self-observation can feel fleeting or difficult to maintain, but over time, with patience, we build an inner muscle, a stable vantage point from which we can observe without collapsing into the thought or the emotion. Meditation, journaling, inner dialogue, and dream work are tools that support this practice. Each moment of awareness, no matter how small, contributes to the larger architecture of an integrated psyche. The more we observe, the less we react. The less we react, the more inner energy becomes available for creativity, insight, and healing. When we catch ourselves in the grip of a toxic thought, for example, "I'm not good enough," awareness invites us to pause. Instead of running with the thought, we turn toward it. We ask, where is this coming from? What is it trying to protect? What deeper part of me feels wounded or unheard? These questions are not meant to fix the thought, but to deepen our relationship with ourselves. Jung's approach was never about silencing the mind, but understanding it. The more we understand, the less we fear. And the less we fear, the less power negativity holds. Projection is another area where self-observation is vital. Jung identified projection as the mechanism by which we attribute our own unconscious content onto others. We may judge, envy, or resent someone else for traits we have not acknowledged in ourselves. When we observe this dynamic without shame, we begin to retrieve those projections and integrate them. This is one of the most powerful aspects of self-observation. It turns conflict into self-knowledge. The people and situations that once triggered us become mirrors, showing us where we are still split inside. Awareness allows us to stop blaming the mirror and start cleaning the lens through which we see. Over time, this practice alters our entire experience of reality. We begin to live with more spaciousness. Emotions arise and fall without overwhelming us. Thoughts come and go without defining us. The mind becomes a tool, not a tyrant. And within this spaciousness, the self, Jung's term for the wholeness that lies beyond the ego, begins to emerge. This emergence is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, stable, deep. The self does not need to kill negative thoughts. It transcends them by integrating their message and releasing their charge. Jung believed that the unconscious is not just a repository of repressed fears, but also of untapped wisdom. Self-observation opens the channel to this wisdom. As we learn to see through the illusions of thought, we start to access the archetypal intelligence that resides within us, the inner healer, the inner teacher, the inner guide. These aspects of the psyche cannot speak when the noise of negativity is too loud. But in the silence of observation, their voice becomes clearer. We start to feel guided not by compulsion, but by clarity, not by fear, but by inner knowing. This transformation is not linear. There are days when the mind seems relentless, when negative thoughts surge like a storm. But even in those moments, the act of observation changes everything. To notice the storm is to remember, you are not the storm. To watch the wave is to remember, you are the ocean. This shift from identification to observation is the core of Jung's psychological alchemy. It is the process through which we take the lead of suffering and transform it into the gold of awareness. Self-observation also has a moral dimension. The more aware we become, the more we realize the impact of our unconsciousness on others. Our words, reactions, projections, all affect the people around us. Awareness makes us more responsible, more compassionate, more aligned. We stop leaking our pain and start healing it. We stop demanding others change and start transforming within. This is the essence of true maturity, not perfection, but presence, not control, but clarity, not dominance over the mind, but dialogue with it. The journey of observation leads us through the labyrinth of the psyche, past the demons of judgment, the ghosts of memory, the illusions of ego, and in the center of that labyrinth, we find the self, watching all along. It is this presence, silent, still, unwavering, that ultimately kills the power of negative thoughts. Not by force, not by denial, but by simply seeing them for what they are, temporary clouds passing across the vast sky of consciousness.